It would be an enormous upset if Count Bin-Face defeated Nigel Farage. It's the record-breaking ballot paper. It's 34 candidates. The ballot paper is 3 feet long. I think it's a good thing in our politics that we don't take our politicians too seriously. Having a Count Bin-Face or an official monster raving loony party candidate is no bad thing. But I think there are now so many people who just want their 15 minutes of fame. It's the record-breaking ballot paper. We have 34 candidates. The ballot paper is 3 feet long, and that's 34 candidates with the main parties not even standing in the election, with the exception, I guess, of Reform. But of course, Labour and the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats and Greens aren't there. So if they were in it, it'd be an even longer ballot paper. I should say that I acknowledge that we have a long history in Britain of eccentric candidates standing for election, and I treasure and value that tradition. But there's a point where the ballot paper becomes so long that it can become unmanageable from the perspective of potentially voters. So it can be, it makes it easier for voters to make a mistake when they vote, or it can take longer to vote. Now, some viewers might say, well, they just have to be a bit more careful, but that is a risk there. It also imposes administrative costs. So to create ballots and ballot envelopes that can be sent out to postal voters when you have a 3-foot ballot, that creates new challenges. It also is just more expensive and more difficult to print. Special printers have to be used and all those things. But actually, I think perhaps you could bear those costs and say, in the grand scheme of things, this is maybe the price of democracy. It's quite trivial. But there is one cost that is quite substantial, which is that every candidate who stands for Parliament is entitled to a free post that goes to every elector in the constituency. In the 2024 general election, Royal Mail delivered 184 million free posts on behalf of parliamentary candidates at that election, which cost the taxpayer £60 million. Now, to put that in perspective, the total cap that a political party can spend in a general election is £30 million. Well, it would be an enormous upset if Count Bin-Face defeated Nigel Farage. I should say that Count Bin-Face himself sits in a long lineage of robotic or whatever you call it, mechanistic joke candidates. So before Count Bin-Face, there was Lord Buckethead. So there is this tradition, and of course there are other joke candidates like the official monster raving loony party, which was set up in the early 1980s. I absolutely do think that the decision of the main parties not to stand against Nigel Farage has attracted more independent and perhaps non-serious candidates. We saw the same in 2008 when David Davis caused a by-election in his Holton Price and Howden seat. That was before Clacton was the record holder for the most candidates standing a by-election. There were 26 of them. I think that the absence of a big party like Labour, and I think the Liberal Democrats also may not have stood in that by-election, then opened a sense that for some of the minor parties, perhaps they might be able to hoover up some of the anti-David Davis vote and perhaps at least secure a sufficient number of votes to hold their deposits so that that standing in the by-election would cost them nothing. The threshold for standing for Parliament is historically really quite low. So ever since the franchise was fully extended to men and first extended to women in 1918, there was a deposit that was introduced that would be returned to candidates if they secured a certain share of the vote. And in 1918, that deposit was £150, and the threshold for returning the deposit was 12.5%. In today's money, that £150 in 1918, I think would be something like £7,500 today. So very, very substantial sum of money. And part of the reason why they did that actually was because from 1918, there were forms of public subsidy for candidates, like support from the Royal Mail for delivering an election address. And parliamentarians were concerned that enterprising business people might stand for Parliament in order to advertise their local businesses. That was really a very high threshold. And in those early days, one of the things that local parties had to spend a lot of time and effort doing at the start of general elections was raising the money for the deposit. And that became a sort of major focus of local party activity. But that amount was not adjusted for inflation. So by the time you get to the 1980s, the value of £150 is much, much lower. And so in 1984, there's a by-election in Chesterfield where Tony Benn stands and gets elected, and 17 candidates stand in the Chesterfield by-election. And so after the Chesterfield by-election, the Thatcher government raises the deposit. There was a committee in the House of Commons that looked into this, and the committee suggested raising the deposit to £1,000, but reducing the threshold for return to 7.5%. But the government went even lower and went to £500 and 5%. And it's remained that ever since 1985. In the 40 years since, inflation has eroded the value of that deposit really quite substantially. I think it's possible now that it has eroded it too low. I wouldn't want a deposit that was so high that it excluded candidates who were, didn't have a lot of money behind them. I don't want money to be the bar to standing for Parliament. I don't want to exclude small parties, and I don't want to exclude even candidates who are standing passionately for a single issue or a local issue that they care about. The types of candidates that I want to exclude are those who stand purely for the vanity of getting their picture taken on the stage and perhaps sending some kind of letter out at the expense of the local electorate. So my proposal would be this. I would put up the cost of the deposit. I would also probably put up the cost of the threshold, maybe to 7.5%. I would lower the deposit value if candidates could attract a certain number of nominations before the election. So let's say that the cost of the deposit went up to £1,500 or even £2,000. I'm not sure exactly what number it'd be. Let's say it was that kind of number, 3 or 4 times what it is now. Well, I would say a candidate who acquired, let's say, 100 signatures of voters in the constituency could reduce the cost of that deposit back down to the 500 mark. And what I think that would do is it would mean that people who were really passionate but didn't have the money could go round a constituency, knock on doors and ask people to support them and get them on the ballot. But what it would exclude would be, dare I say it, some of those lazier, self-promoting publicist type candidates who I think we can do without. I recognise that in British politics, we do have a certain irreverence in our elections. And I think it's a good thing in our politics that we don't take our politicians too seriously, and that there should be a bit of a knockabout in elections. And I think that someone like having a Count Bin Face or an official monster raving loony party candidate who is there as a kind of none of the above choice for the electorate is no bad thing. And so I wouldn't want to exclude those. But I think there are now so many people who just want their 15 minutes of fame on the platform and want to do it at the public's expense, which is part of the problem here. It makes it harder we didn't mention counting the ballots, but it's going to be a pretty tough thing for the local authority in Clacton to be counting all of these different ballots, because we still hand count ballots in really quite a traditional way. And of course, the longer it takes to count ballots, the more that costs us as taxpayers from our council tax money. So again, I'm not a penny pincher on these things, but I think we have to weigh up the public value of some of these candidates against the cost that they impose on the rest of us.